Are we ready and connected? Our friend is different. Do we have connection with Ivan Krastev?
Yes, I'm on the line.
Hello, Ivan.
Hello.
Hello, Professor Parvu. Do you hear me?
Yes, hello.
Hello. So, let me welcome everybody in the audience. This is a round table dedicated to the book The Great Regression, international debate about the spiritual situation of our time. In the very title there is a clear reference to the Jasper's book about the spiritual situation of our time. About the publication of this book will speak my friend Antoinette, the publisher. I'll say some words about its problems, but first let me introduce the participants in this roundtable and order of presentations. That's me, Alexander Kiossev from the University of Sofia. I will moderate the discussion. Next to me is Antoinette, the publisher. And our foreign guests are Professor Camil Parvu from the Department of Political Science, University of Bucharest, and Professor Soli Ozel from the International Relations Department at the Istanbul University. Another Bulgarian participations are Professor Stilyan Yotov, Assistant Professor, Associate Professor Vassil Vidinsky, and Associate Professor Todor Hristov. And the discutant, the general discussion, will be one of the important participants of the book itself, one of the authors. This is our friend Ivan Krastev. He is located in Vienna at the Institut für Wissenschaften von Menschen. These are the participants, and this will be also the order of presentations. First, the moderator will have the floor, then the publisher. After that, our friend from Bucharest University. Next to him is Professor Stilyan Yotov, and next to him is Professor Soli Ozel from Istanbul, then Vassil Vidinsky, Todor Hristov, and at the end the floor will be in Ivan Krastev's hands. So, what is the reason for this discussion? First, we believe that this is a very, very important book. It consists of contributions of several major theoreticians and sociologists, historians, philosophers, mainly from the left. They discuss the situation of neoliberal globalization and its unexpected bad consequences. Shortly, the book is about the consequences of the deregulation of the cooperative capital, which transcends the limits of national states, erodes the national states and their institutions, and produce zones without statehood, possible zones for terrorism, for national populism and xenophobia. This contributes to the growth of economic inequalities and various strange, newly born at the same time very old ideologists, populists and nationalists. So a strange situation of hysteria in the public discourses about possible danger of state authoritarianism, and on the door there are different immigrants and people who escaped the war in Syria and so on. Shortly, it's about the loss of post-liberal consensus, the neoliberal consensus. It's about a situation which is absolutely unclear and where the reaction of the losers of the globalization is very strange. It's not, let's say, they are not joining the leftist movement, they are joining right-wing movements, some of them very dangerous, with very dangerous xenophobic ideas. So, in fact, one can say that the promise of the neoliberal globalization. It will be a rule of law. It will be. It will create a kind of cosmopolitan we, identity of everybody included in this neoliberal process. The promises about economic growth, they prove to be not quite true. They produce unexpected results, and these results are to be discussed. In the book itself, 15 contributions from different countries, from worldly famous theoreticians like Apollodorei, Zygmunt Bauman, like Bruno Latour or Nancy Fraser, and a lot of others are contributing to these problems, and they're discussing under the very clear statement, great regression, not great regression with question marks, only great regression. So that's a clear statement that the symptoms of these regressions are here, and we have to discuss them, we have to, in a way, interpret them. When reading this book, I had the impression that the perspective is too Eurocentric, in a way. Although the book pretends to be a global book, it's in fact focused on Western Europe and America, and a lot of other different local experiences are not taken into account. So our idea was that we should discuss the same book, the same problems, the problems of the, let's say, problematic globalization, but from local perspective. Of course, everybody is free to do his or her own comments, so this is not a necessary frame. This is just a proposal. But this was the proposal, to create the local perspective discussing the global problems, because the global perspective is not enough. We believe that from the local perspective we are able to say much more about the same situation. And we believe also that the local perspective could be heuristic. It could, in a way, discover certain new aspects of the global problematics. Actually, we have enough reasons to expect that, because what happened on the Balkans in the last 20 years is really dramatic. Remember the disintegration of Yugoslavia, the bloody wars, the coup in Turkey, the financial crisis in Greece, and the strange kind of transition in Bulgaria. These are enough reasons to discuss global problems from local perspective and create a kind of corrective to the global perspective. So we are discussing the problematic consequences of globalization. At the same time, the challenges are not only to the neoliberal globalization itself. The challenges are to the critique of this global situation. The critique in this book is produced from leftist positions. Mostly, many of these theoreticians are standing on the left. But they themselves confess that the left is confronted with huge challenges. For example, should it preserve its universalism, or should it react locally and sometimes nationally? Certain left theoreticians defend the national state, which is quite unexpected. Another possible challenge to the critique of globalization is whether we should support these strange right-wing national populistic movements, or should we support and use them and try to, let's say, transform them to be supporters of the leftist cause, or on the opposite, should we oppose to these liberal, to these national populistic movements? For example, the disagreement and the discussion among Slavoj Žižek and the missing Chantal Mouffe from this book is about exactly that. Chantal Mouffe proposes that we should use the national populistic movement for the lefty cause. And for Žižek this is wrong. For him there is another perspective, which is to produce more universalism, more traditional leftist program about emancipation of every possible level of emancipation. So this was my introduction. I will moderate the discussion, and I'm giving the floor to the publisher Antoinette Koleva, who has the great privilege to publish this in Bulgarian and to be in contact with all these publishers and authors.
Thank you. Hi everybody, nice to see you. I'm delighted. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, dear guests. Thank you, Camil, Parvu. Thank you, Professor Alexander Kiossev. My name is Antoinette Koleva, and I'm the representative of the Bulgarian language publisher of the book. So I will try to talk short, but do excuse me if if I don't manage to. So, is the world going into reverse? This is the title under which you could find the Great Regression project on the internet. I mean, this is you could find on the internet the book, all the information about the book, the collection, and the international debate accompanying the publications. At the address is www.thegreatregression.eu or alternatively www.thegrosseregression.eu, just like Deutschland. Maybe I might just say a couple of words about the book, but I'm not going into the details because of everything that Professor Kiossev has just said. But let me say that we owe the book to the Zurkamp Publishing House and to Heinrich Geiselberger, the editor of the book. The book is discussing, 15 contributors, be they political analysts, be they opinion makers, or just public intellectuals. They are discussing some alarming developments in our nowadays world, and developments that seemed impossible several years ago. According to the authors of the book, as a globally connected world, we are falling behind once attained standards, be they social, political, or even psychological. And all these marks of nowadays situation contribute to the impression of a great regression. In fact, this expression is coined after the idea of the German analyst Oliver Nachtwey, who thinks that we are witnessing an ongoing regressive modernization concerning the well-developed Western world. And that is why, this is etymologically the root of the phrase or of the name, the Great Regression, the proposal of the Oliver Nachtwey. All these contributors, they're looking for really the roots and the causes of these processes, of this phenomena of the global regression. And sometimes, some of them are trying to propose, to offer strategies for overcoming such a state. So the book responds to our current state of global turbulence and lowering our standards of, so to say, of our civilizational standards. And the book is trying to mobilize the potential of a transnational public sphere to give its responses to this state of affairs. But it is not only a book, it is an international debate, as I have already said. So please take a look at the internet page of the project. Let me say once again, thank all of you, thank you, Professor Kiossev, for having the idea to organize such a roundtable. and to try to add some regional perspectives toward the global debate, because in fact the idea of the possibilities to discuss local and regional possibilities is an idea of Alexander Kiossev. That's not... Yeah. I would like also to thank once again Camil Parvu from Bucharest, Professor Soli Ozel from Istanbul.
Are you going to be in school in an hour?
Yes.
Come back in an hour. Okay. Right.
And to thank Ivan Krastev in Vienna also. Thank you so much. In such a version of conversation, I mean trying to add regional perspectives, the initial question, the title of the project, Is the World Going into Reverse? Is becoming, is our local world, let me say our Bulgarian world, is going into reverse? And if so, in which ways, I would say. Allow me to mention that such a question may be in an ironic mood, that such a question is somehow reminiscent of a question Immanuel Kant poses in his writing, The Conflict of the Faculties. Has there been a constant progress of the mankind? And I think his analysis, I mean the analysis of Immanuel Kant, is quite instructive in a way. So, I clearly remember that when the idea for this publication into Bulgarian language came, I was thinking at that time, me too, but I was not alone sure, that we were living once unimaginable declines in terms of political mentality and everyday psychology of the social actors. And that the local situation here in Bulgaria was even worsening, aggravating the global picture. After the very publication of the book, it became immediately popular locally. Comments on the collection never stopped since its appearance, and we were finding out that every sort of experts, be they lawyers, psychologists, even experts in security area, they have been relying on the book, for example, in their talks in the media. And it is obvious that these people, these authors, these analysts, they already have a discourse with the authors of the collection, so that's quite significant, I think. But now I'm starting to speak as a publisher, and I am going to say just a couple more words, sure, without pretending to be a political expert, because I think everybody should stay in his or her own field of expertise. My main point concerns the need to clarify a bit the very concept of regression when applying to the local world. I am emphasizing the local world of a post-socialist social reality. It is quite detrimental to work through concepts blocks, totalizing concepts, just like the concept of West, for example, is, but also just like the concept of regression should or could work. So I'm sure skipping the cultural and geographical nuances could become a way of manipulating, among the other things. So it could be useful, I think, to see the local strata, the local layers of the concept. In our case, such a procedure could go through emphasizing the many different points of view, according to which, first, there could be no regression at all locally. Second, and as strange as it could sound, the so-called regression could even appear as an advancement. And third, sure, that there could be many various regression, ones which add their pernicious effect to the so-called global regression. First, on the one hand, and as far as regression literally means going back to a previous state, we shall first of all ask where exactly we, locally in Bulgaria, would be going back to if we are to be defined, to be detected as living a regression. What shall the regression mean regarding a post-socialist society like ours? In such a perspective, and from only a first point of view, sure, one should definitely say, no, we are not living a regression here, not at all. So first, if the regression is just a sort of going back to a previous state of political mentality and social reality, there is no such thing like a regression here in Bulgaria, and that's a good thing too. But if such would be the case, and if well-developed European and world democracies go through a process of regressive modernization, as Oliver Nachtwey says, then we should ask through what kind of transformation the Eastern and Southeastern European post-socialist societies go. Is that just some centripetal move after a period of some opposite centrifugal moves? And it is just temporary? And how frightening is that? Second, if the regression means going back from a position of quite a highly developed state of effective democracy and quite a civilized political mentality and political practices, then, once again, there is no regression here in Bulgaria. The situation is worse here in Bulgaria. Such a phenomenon hardly be possible here. I mean, a great regression hardly be possible in principle, just because of the fact that we are a compensating democracy. I mean, a democracy trying to fed up, to compensate its almost 50 years socialist period of dropping behind the democratic developments. Could we say that we are falling down in a move of regression when there is no certainty at all we have achieved any highness in terms of political practices and political mentality? In such a perspective, so-called regression could be locally nothing but a lack of democratic and political advancement. So, we shall say we live a relative failure of progressing instead of living a great regression. And to clarify a little bit this point, it seems to me that we live locally not just under the power of some internal attractors, which are coming from our past and preventing us from going ahead, from getting forward and from advancing and maybe after that regressing. But we also live under the gravity of so-called external attractors, I mean attractor in terms of physics, but also in terms of Jean Baudrillard, such as the one radiating its power from the northeast, I mean the regime of Putin's Russia. And that attractor, firmly rooted in our history, in the past, mainly in our socialist past, this attractor makes it harder to get forward, to go ahead. A big and long story would be the story about the local dimensions of the so-called hybrid war I'm guessing here about. Maybe in order to go after that under a purifying regression, we need firstly to advance, because it is quite possible the regression to start here working after an advancement, excuse me. Maybe it would be possible then to leave a regression and the regression to start working as a medicine, as a very bitter pill. Sorry for getting a little bit confused, I mean, in my talking. But be it that way or another, what a complicated picture of every sort of possible regressions here, locally. And maybe at the third place I would say that if one takes one by one the particular symptoms of, that's absolutely, that's another point of view, that's absolutely different point of view. If one takes one by one the particular symptoms of the regression, as they are described by the authors of the book, the authors of the collection, The Great Regression, then we could find here locally that many of these symptoms do exist here locally, and being in addition worsened, aggravated by other purely local symptoms. And I would just mention in a couple of words only phenomena such as, first, living in a local radio world that is not just polluted with fake news, but that is predominated by a cynical, lying and very potent propaganda. One media world which is to serve economic interests of the local mafia. I remember that the journalist Misha Geza has recently said that the world is living with a new generation of monsters, and obviously she has had in mind some political monsters, but I would say that here locally in Bulgaria we are living with our local monsters. So I'm finishing, no more local phenomena. I just, because the picture is going to seem quite dark, I'd like to finish with just a line, with just a word of optimism, saying that the book had to be published in 14 languages, but in fact the Chinese language edition has not appeared yet, and this is just because there is a state censorship in China. So when compared to China, we are living in a relative progress, so to say, here locally in Bulgaria. Thank you.
Thank you, Antoinette. So you can see that there are kind of paradoxes between progression and regression. And certain parts of the world are living maybe in a failure of progression, not in a project which had bad consequences and now is in a regression. So if the global situation is the regression of the very project of neoliberal globalization, modernization, emancipation and whatever, so our problem is that we never achieved this state. We never achieved the goal of this project. And this is a kind of different perspective to very temporality of late modernity. I am giving the floor to our Romanian friend, Professor Camil Parvu from Bucharest University.
Thank you very much. How many minutes do I have right now?
10 minutes, 15 minutes maximum.
So, thank you. Just a few words to present myself and then I'm going to start. So I'm Associate Professor at the Political Science Department, University of Bucharest. I have worked a lot on cosmopolitanism and populism. And right now I'm here in Paris, associated researcher of the Collège d'Études Mondiales, which is a entity of the foundation, which is called Fondation Maison des Sciences de l'Homme. So first, please let me thank you for the invitation. And let me congratulate you for the setting up this conference and for having undergone all this effort to develop a local reflection on these global problems and on the global effort to think about this great recession that we have undergoing. And it is really a pleasure for me to take part in your effort. It's really very important that such centers for articulating a reflection on these issues take part also in our universities. I'd like to start with with the question that both of you raised, which is what, of course, is the meaning of a regression in Central, Eastern, and Southern Eastern Europe. A regression in relation to what? What is the point in relation to which there is a regression? And this is a very important, indeed, question. I think it's something that we have to think through very well, because it may be very obvious for the authors of the book and for those who think within a sort of Western thinking about this, that the regression is about sort of a gold age of liberal democracy and welfare state, which of course is not really the same kind of experience for the countries that were beyond the Iron Curtain. So probably to start, we could say that this regression is probably, in our cases, in the cases of these countries and these societies, more about a regression in relation to the promises of 1989 and of some of these initial principles of state building, statecraft that we were more or less all engaged in during the last 25 years. So this is a very good point about what is the regression of in Eastern Europe and Southern Eastern Europe. And again, what kind of promises have been not fulfilled so that we could speak, of course, about a regression. And this is something that leads us to, of course, articulate a more local notion of the regression, which is not necessarily incompatible. Of course, it's not at all incompatible. It's a complementary kind of construction to those that are already present in the book. Probably some of the phenomena that we deal with in these countries, and of course I will speak a little bit more about Romania, are in a way very similar to those that are in Western Europe and in the rest of the region, like populism and so on. Okay. These are, of course, common phenomena. But at the same time, they have some local reasons for existence, and they have some local declinations. They happen in a different way. And I will start, for instance, with an example related to the fact that a very specific evolution in, let's say, Western Europe, Eastern Europe. I use these terms with a lot of caution, of course, but a very specific evolution was the demise, the slow demise of the social democratic parties. This is something that was very important, lots of studied in political science, why the social democratic parties after 2010 have started to more or less not necessarily collapse, but yeah, in certain cases collapse, like in France, in Greece, and so on. And that there is a sort of corresponding rise of the populist right on the reasons for the decline of the social democratic parties. And of course, a lot of these discussions may be around why these social democratic parties went through such a huge crisis, and why these populist parties have been capable of taking up and developing their own constituencies on the basis of such. But in Eastern Europe, there is no similar decline of the social democratic parties, for the reason that the social democratic parties or the left-wing parties in Eastern Europe, of course, have very different kinds of pedigrees. It's very interesting to see certain kind of distinctions also in Eastern Europe, Central and Eastern Europe. And I will take two examples. One case is of surviving social democratic parties which do actually very well, which are nominally social democratic, but which actually have undergone a substantial evolution and modification on the one hand, and on the other hand, disappearing social democratic parties. So parties which were also parties of government in the 90s and the early 2000s and 2000, and then basically collapsed. And it's very interesting to see that, for instance, in Hungary and in Poland, the previous governing social democratic parties have more or less disappeared. They're not in parliament, or if they're still in parliament, they're in a very fragile position. And their collapse, of course, has been complemented by the rise of Fidesz and of PiS in Poland. However, in other countries, and I again mentioning Romania and Slovakia, the social democratic parties are still there, yet very much different from equivalent social democratic parties in Western Europe. So these are actually extremely conservative political constructions that manage to survive probably precisely because they have embraced very much social conservatism and local variation of populism. Now this is a very interesting way to compare experiences. On the one hand, we speak about the same terms, populism for instance, which is of course very much present, and authoritarian demagogues, they are very much present throughout Europe, but the reasons for their existence may be different. And we have to think about this because of course the social democratic parties in Europe were at the same, in Western Europe, they were constitutive to the welfare state and to the welfare consensuses that have been, let's say, the golden age of which the Great Regression is to make sense. Whereas in Eastern Europe, the social democratic parties, at least in several of these countries, have had a very different kind of history, and they may not necessarily be perceived as sort of constitutive part of the progressive, at least in countries like Romania and Slovakia necessarily, not similarly again in Poland and in Hungary. They have a different, again, a different pedigree. Another very important part of the political landscape in Central and Eastern Europe, which is really part of the emerging, not necessarily emerging because they are for some time already, political cleavages. Right? One of the interesting discussions is, and I managed to do a search for terms in the book, and the word corruption shows up 6 times in the whole book. And that's, I think, quite interesting. It mostly shows up in relation to the corruption of the 1%, and a couple of times it shows up in relation to corruption of Spain's political elite. Whereas, of course, in Eastern Europe it is probably at the core of the one of the main political cleavages, right? The whole configuration of the political landscape in several of these countries may be around the issue of corruption. Who's corrupt? What kind of corruption? And this is a very important thing about thinking about the state, thinking about social trust, thinking about institutions, thinking about the decline of political participation and so on, and about the kind of social conflicts that arise around this issue. It's a really important topic that also goes at the part of the meaning of several of these parties and, of course, of the whole populist authoritarian experience. Corruption is really something that we mobilize in our thinking about what's going on very often. But, of course, corruption in these countries may have different kind of uses. The discussion about corruption, the discourses against corruption, these have different uses. And of course, not all the uses may be equally relevant for our discussion. But I think it's really one of those sort of missing parts of the book that a local Central Eastern and Southern Eastern European experience may complement and may add up because I think it's really crucial. Again, the fate of the left. I have mentioned differences in the fate of political parties, the rise of new left political parties in such countries, in Poland with Razem Partia, in Romania with Demos, and in Serbia. There is, however, a conundrum that I'm not sure how we thinking about this left political movement may help to clarify such thing, because the conundrums and the challenges are really important, and they are also pan-European, not only specifically Central or Eastern or Southeastern European. One of the challenges for the left which is more or less specific to these countries, is that it has to somehow reconnect. It has the question of how to reconnect with the fact that there is a dominant conservative majority in these countries. Now, social conservatism is really a huge part of the contemporary difficulties of the left to reconnect and to make sense, think again about how and what to represent. The temptation of clinging on past concepts of sovereignty is also one of these challenges. The temptation to go back and to think as the state is still in control. And you see some of these tendencies that are quite present at the same time, that are really to challenge probably and to think about it, how much really it's possible for any kind of political movement to think in terms of self-contained economy within the nation-state frontiers. And correlated to that, there is a growing reaction of some of these lefts against the European Union as such. It's not only Lexit, so the idea of the British, some of the British left that actually getting out of the European Union allows a more socially responsible set of policies in UK. But it's also the fact that increasingly a number of left-wing economists and left-wing political activists think that the EU it cannot be saved from this perspective, and it becomes a sort of available option, maybe even privileged option for some of these lefts in plural to simply discard any kind of project for building something European-wide within the EU. And this is something which is really concerning.
Professor Parvu, I would like to ask you to go slowly to the end of your statement because we have to preserve the temporal limitations of our roundtable. Please end your statement.
I will just sum up that, I really appreciate this effort to think about a sort of more local, regional perspective on the problematic of the Great Regression, and it's really something that has to be built from the common things and also from the complementary approaches that we can develop throughout these debates. Thank you.
Thank you. So the floor is to our friend and colleague, Professor Stilyan Yotov from Sofia University. After him is our Turkish colleague from Istanbul University, Professor Soli Ozel.
Okay, thank you very much for this possibility to express some thought about the book, about how I read the proposals and what I think about the reception of these debates here in Bulgaria. First, I have to introduce myself. So I'm a professor in history of philosophy and philosophy of law at Sofia University, but I'm also engaged in some translations of contemporary philosophers in the area of the critical theory of Frankfurt School. So I'm somehow connected with the published program of Zurkamp, and so also with Antoinette Koleva. I translated also for her some pieces, and it's the reason why I'm somehow very friendly to many of those authors in my attitude to them. And it's not so easy to be critical against friends, But first of all, I would like to share some points which I find a kind of presupposition before to stress the topic of this discussion in the book. I think that probably for all of us is a sense of a normal feeling to live in a certain world or to feel the progress. Maybe no one will say that the opposite is also a position which could be preferred by a person. But at the on the other side, when we speak about progress and regress, we know from Asian philosophy a sentence written by or said by Heraclit that the way upstairs is the way downstairs. So in many cases we are not quite sure if we are faced with progress or with regress. And in front of these two presuppositions, I will also say that we all in this room and our colleagues in the internet discussion share this experience, how many frameworks of our picture of the world we have to give up in the last 10 or 15 years. First of all, it was the big narrative. But at the other side, we were also happy that living without big narratives, we have the possibility to live in a pluralist world and to think from a multi-perspective point of view about our life. The second framework we gave up was the idea of a causal, directed development of the history, but it was also a chance to think that it could be a liberation also from this ideology, from regimes which has been just put on ourselves. The third framework was the idea of secularization. There are so many social theorists who developed their models of secularization, and today it's not the case that we are still living anymore in a secular situation. Probably it's a post-secular one, but in this case we also saw new sources for a better motivation, probably to a motivation also for democratic development. So you see that in many cases a kind of destruction, a kind of could be a kind of liberation. And on the other side, also probably we have some feelings that there were also processes which couldn't be explained as a crisis or regress, but only as a progress. And for many of us, it was the European integration, probably not for all of us, but also the globalization, and the many revolutions which brought many countries on the side of the democracy. And the third domain, we can also describe some events as disasters, as crises. Probably this is the war in Yugoslavia, the Brexit, and the unexpected economic crisis. So I think that all these three possibilities are somehow very well explained as a diagnosis in the book, besides that, and despite of the fact that not all the participants discussed them systematically. But why they decided to call the book Great Regression? I think that it's interesting title. It's a title leading your attention, but we have also this experience in Bulgaria that we discussed many times our way to the democracy under the notions: is it a crisis or catastrophe? What is our destiny? Are we living in a crisis or catastrophe? And if we look at these two concepts, catastrophe is something very irregular, very is much more bigger than a regular crisis. So a big regress has to be a situation which is not very usual, and and it's also for me a problem. Is it really the case that the situation described in this book or discussed in this book could be explained as real, as something which we compare to the Big Depression in the world history? And I think that there is a point which was not so well explained in the book, but in many debates it became clear that today we have to give up another framework, and Alexander Kiossev mentioned it as neoliberal consensus. But I think that it's not only consensus in the ideology, it's a principle used by most economists in the 20th century. There is a so-called Bowley's law. According to this law, the wage share of a country's output has to be constant through the years. And it was some kind of a rule which nobody questioned, but it became clear in sociological and economic surveys that it's not the case, and probably in the time between the 19th and the end of the 20th century, only 2% of the households didn't enjoy an income raise. But today, in the new century, we have a new situation that the wage share has fallen or remained the same, and it's really a new principle which have to be accepted not only from the Eastern European point of view, but from all positions. And there are also other data which have been mentioned as some kind of democratic distrust or anti-establishment movement, some kind of populism. But the idea or the problem which I see in this discussion is, do we have any islands of security or any island of the development of our democratic way of life, of our institution, which could be used to move against or to cure the regress. And this is the feeling in Bulgaria or in some neighbor countries that there is a difference between our feeling our trust in the institutions and the trust in the older democratic states. For example, one of the biggest a domain where we don't have this feeling of security and trust is the court system, the law system. And it's really another sense of regression that their falling down is not like ours, because they have still the possibility to find the right judge, to find the right prosecutor. The other domain are probably the media. Okay, there is a big crisis in the fake news in the world, not only in Bulgaria or in Western Europe, but I think that it's very easy to see that probably we don't have any newspaper which we can show today as a newspaper or a media which is expressing a sense of honesty, a sense of honor behavior. And that's the reason why most of us are still reading newspapers and news, not only from Bulgaria, but from most countries in Western Europe. I think that there is really a big difference in the standards of the public debates, public sphere, which was developed and which is not so ruined in old Europe, and it's not the same in the new democracies. So this is probably not all the points which I wanted to stress as differences, but I think that they are enough to discuss it further.
Thank you very much. And now the floor is given to our Turkish friend, Professor Soli Ozel from Istanbul. Please, Professor Ozel.
Thank you very much. It's the benefits of technology. I'm grateful that I could participate. But technology is not only beneficial. Obviously, I don't wish to go through what the previous two speakers so eloquently presented. I'll stay at a more pedestrian level, if you will. But obviously, we benefit a lot from technology, like in this case, in order to be able to communicate with one another without being physically there, although it's not the same thing. But the same technology is also generating incredible levels of disruption And I think part of the problem about this great regression we speak of must have something to do, and I think it does have something to do, with the pace of technological change and the inability of social order or the political order to actually come to terms with the rapidity, with the speed of this technological change and the disruptions that it is wreaking. So long as this continues, I think we will be, if not resentful, certainly regretting that a bygone era that most of us have obviously have liked a lot, and its presumptions, its assumptions, its principles, its values may not be as valid or as consequential as at one point they may have been. Now, I think on the one hand we have synchronized development around the world that stems from the world's, different parts of the world's reaction to globalization and the culture and the civilization that it generated. But also I think we are also seeing different developments in different parts of the world in qualitative terms, which are centered around the middle classes. First of all, and I'll come to this, and I really will try to be brief. What is happening is the unraveling of the world we've been accustomed to. The unraveling has arguably begun with the end of the Cold War. An order that we were accustomed to is no longer there, and I think we have lost a lot of references. And I'm not sure that with the end of the Cold War, if we look at Europe, the Europeans, the Western Europeans, have totally understood exactly what the end of the Cold War would actually mean, and the Easterners obviously wanted to jump on the bandwagon of a successful experiment, thinking that the success would continue, they would benefit from its bounty and all that, and that really didn't happen, partially because, as I said, most of us have either misjudged or have not fully comprehended all the connotations, all the implications of the end of the Cold War. So, and the question that is bothering us, I suppose, the reason why we lament this great regression from liberal principles, regression from participation, regression from a language, a vocabulary of rights, a vocabulary of freedoms, a vocabulary of togetherness and multiculturalism and all that, is the place we seem to be going towards really denies almost all those things that at one point many of us have held sacrosanct. And it seems to me, or at least the way I think about this is, both to understand how we got to where we used to like and how we are moving away from what we used to like, we really need to look at the middle classes. The middle classes as economic actors, agents, and subjects, as well as middle classes as cultural subjects. And I make personally a distinction, or I differentiate between what goes on in the developed world and the consequences of the crisis of the middle classes, whether that crisis be, and in the middle classes I also include working classes that have actually managed to have middle class incomes and they could actually benefit from what the society was, or what the economy was offering to them. Economically and culturally, the decline of the middle class, the stagnation of wages, most prevalent in Anglo-Saxon countries, except for Canada, and the cultural reactions to, on the one hand, atomization, on the other, political correctness, liberal culture, and all that. A combination of those has generated among the middle classes a reaction to what is considered to be, in my view, an unfair society. There is a question of lack of or the decline of legitimacy among the elites. The elites are no longer capable of persuading the public that they know what they're doing and that what they're doing is going to be to the benefit of everyone. And it isn't just the political elite that have lost their luster, in my judgment. I also think that the intellectuals that have spoken to one another in this particular frame and kind of either became alienated or distant from their constituencies or the general public, they are also part of those who have lost trust. Therefore, our inability to communicate what we perceive as a danger to a larger segment of the population, whose resentments trump almost every other sentiment that they might have, and may play certainly as important a role in the way they either reject or move away from the so-called liberal order, maybe more so. But in the developing countries, I sense we need to look at the middle class formations, middle class dynamics differently. I make a distinction which is similar to a distinction that David Miliband made. I can't remember exactly the terms he used, but similar terms between status middle classes and the market middle classes in those countries. Status middle classes have been, as the first colleague from Romania has said, secular-oriented, modernizers, probably took the West as the model that was to be emulated, because there was also nothing on offer, if you will, and to the extent that others have tried to emulate the Soviet model or the Leninist model, this was also part and parcel of the Western canon, if you will. And they obviously were not necessarily representatives, these elites were not necessarily representatives of the bulk of their populations, mostly in rural societies and stuff. To cut it short, as countries developed, as mass migration began to take place from rural areas to urban areas, from villages to cities and stuff, a lot of those who were kind of enfranchised but not necessarily full participants have become full participants. And as the economies opened up and became market economies, less restricted, more open, thanks to globalization as well, the market equalized them with the status elites, with the force of money that they have earned. And as they gained more power, and once especially the Cold War was over, I think the more ingrained values of the bulk of the population that was now empowered has begun to assert itself. That's how I see the rise of someone like Tayyip Erdogan in Turkey, or Narendra Modi in India, for instance. For better or worse, the original anti-colonial elites, or the elites that have formed the Turkish Republic, were modernists, Western-looking and their thinking was rational, a concept that is made a lot of in the collection of essays that you put together, and this was the model that they had in mind. You can say that they were, as such, much more cosmopolitan oriented, whereas the ones who are now coming of age, who are actually gaining power, who are challenging the existing order of things, both domestically and to a certain extent internationally, rely more on native values. These may be constructs as well. Obviously, they don't come in pure form from time immemorial either. Those are all constructs, but nonetheless, the references are to a different set of principles and values, and that crash, I think, manifests itself especially on this issue of secularism. Again, the role of religion in this sense is not about religiosity, but is in terms of its ability to facilitate a networking among those who are rising up, and religion or religious affinity actually defines them against an established elite and its principles. In fact, one of the very interesting things about the American experiment, to the extent that I follow it, is how the evangelicals, which are supposed to be so conservative and religious and all that, come to tolerate so much of what Trump does, and Trump is not necessarily a very religious person, which then, again, fortifies, in my view, in my mind, the idea that religion, more than just being a belief system, is more a facilitator of networking for those who are rising in the new setup in both modern and modernizing or rising and rising countries. That is the gist of what I'm telling. And I actually do not like the debate to the extent that it concentrates on lamenting the rise of people who are not rational, who are impulsive, who are following demagogues and stuff in an age of uncertainty. I would first start with the fault of the existing elites or the previous elites in creating such conditions for a bursting out of resentment. And rather than trying to endlessly analyze the phenomenon, what I would suggest we need to do is to actually figure out ways of communicating different ideas to the larger public, which is driven towards populist leaders, by organizing and by finding new ways of participation. I honestly do not know how to go about that. I honestly do not know how to rebuild the trust that I believe has been broken between elites and the general public. I don't know how to go about income inequality in an age when those who hold something are unwilling to actually give it up. And I also am not quite sure that we have the cultural vocabulary to be both credible and to be convincing, to get to the bottom of this and then manage to mobilize people towards a different type of organizing politics, speaking about politics. Ivan just published a piece yesterday in which there is a sentence. He says, we cannot, Ivan, correct me if I'm remembering it, when you say we cannot really try to outdo the populists in their styles, we have to find a different style to fight them. Something along those lines, towards the end of the article. That is really what I have in mind as well. And unless we can do that, we cannot beat them at their own game. I'll finish with with a couple of observations about Turkey. Every time the opposition party tries to play a big game with Erdogan, they always play it in his field with his rules. You cannot win that way. You've got to be able to find a different set of rules. You have to be able to reframe the debate, and you've got to be able to find a vocabulary that does not emulate the populist leader, who is obviously much more successful at it than you can be. So this is a very large agenda. I'm not sure that the populist wave and this regression are going to end anytime soon. But as I said, rather than keep on talking about how we lament what is going on, we've got to figure out ways of we've got to figure out the strategies with which to at least at first stop its growth, and then fight it back. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Ozel. So if you are able to stay and join the discussion afterwards, we will be very happy. And if you are busy, then goodbye. But let me say in advance that we are planning a publication, a local publication, with Romanian, Turkish, Serbian and other contributions contributors to this topic, so we will address you again. So I'm giving the floor to my colleague and friend, Associate Professor Vassil Vidinsky.
Hello, I teach in History Philosophy department. And I would like to say several things about the local point of view, the local perspective. But at the end, maybe I'll address some of the more global issues, which I have heard now some things, and I want to comment on them if we have time. First, I think that basically what happens here in Bulgaria has quite many common features if you compare to the book The Great Regression. I will mention several of them, and then I'll add something which I think changes the perspective a little bit. First, I think that the notion by Oliver Nachtwey about regressive modernization is a really good one. So basically, I think that in regressive modernization, you can have some parts of the society, it could be technology, or in our case here in Bulgaria, we think that we have gained some new values after 1989. So if we have this feeling of modernization, that we are going forward, that we are somehow progressing. But on the other hand, you can have at the same time regress. And what's even worse, that when you have such a modernization, this regress is not visible in the beginning. So basically, you don't pay attention to it. And I would like to think a little bit more about the idea, some of the ideas, and maybe some of them are just metaphors, about what happened in 1989. Because we tried to restore something. You can hear people talking like this, to restore what, like maybe freedom, liberty, some idea of democracy, maybe which we haven't forgotten about. And afterwards we talked about integration with the European Union. So we have integration, we have liberty, but actually what we did in practical terms is that we have restored a previous state which, if you read Bulgarian thinkers in the end of 19th century and in the beginning of 20th century, they complain about similar things. They complain about the media, which is somehow run by mafia, or they complain about rigged elections. Actually, we have restored something which we didn't want to restore. So there is a contradiction here. But because the values were really good values, like liberty, freedom, democracy, we thought about this restoration as something, as a byproduct. But I have doubts that actually it's just a byproduct. And I want to say something more about what we have achieved. Like first, if we are concerned about the Bulgarian society, we have sharp decline of our population. For example, if we think in this way, it started in the 90s, in the early 90s. People were like almost 9 million, something like this. And the prognosis, what will happen in 2040, is actually the realistic prognosis is there will be like 6 million. It was said in 2008. In 2015, it's already 6, a little bit below 6. And from Eurostat, it will be like 5,800,000. So basically, it's a sharp decline for all. It will, if it will happen like this, it will be a decline for 50 years. I think it's quite objective fact of regress. And on the other hand, we have rising inequality in the society. Of course, we have this nationalist movements, and so on and so on. So basically, there's some objective facts which we can trace, and on the other hand, the interpretation of many people in Bulgaria is that actually there is something like a regress. But I'd like to change a little bit the concept. I think the term regress is not the exact thing which happens. And I would reformulate it in such a way that if we had high values which we wanted to achieve as goals, but basically what we have produced is some objective facts which we think as a regression, basically it means that we have a contradiction. So the idea of regressive modernization, this concept has in itself the idea of contradiction. So what we are doing when we have social contradictions, if we don't pay attention to these contradictions, I think the movement has three steps. First, there is a change of moods. People start to look for a solution, but they don't know where to find the solution because it's a basic contradiction within the society. Then it's quite obvious that there will be anger because you cannot find a solution, that things don't change. You preserve the contradiction. And then, of course, this anger will lead to aggression, to radicalization. And we can see it in Bulgaria too. But that means that basically what maybe happened here is that there was a silent depression. And because we had these high values, we just were talking to people like this, but okay, maybe you don't feel now good, but in the future it will be better. But of course we have heard many times this before 1989. So people are much more used to being skeptical about the future now. And I would like to end this short presentation by thinking about these contextual contradictions. Because basically, I'm afraid that we don't have solutions. If you have a contradiction within the context, you don't have a solution. The only thing which you can do is to transform the context. It doesn't get rid of the contradiction. It just put this contradiction in other frame. So it's quite painful and difficult project, and maybe at the end you won't be so happy. But that means that if I want to comment about what Soli Ozel said, that you don't need only the change of style to attack, for example, the discourse of Trump or somebody else. Because there's no way to have a sophisticated style which can answer the contradictory problems. Basically what happens is that when you have such anger, change of mood, and then radicalization, the only obvious solutions for people is basically emotional. So this is, I think this is the most difficult task which we deal with. That there's no easy way to address this, because we have already, I think, lost a little bit of time not to paying attention to this. And of course, I'll end this that if you have such uncertainty and if such a chaotic behavior, of course we don't have to blame the people, but I think we have to make the contradictions much more precise. What contradicts what? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Vassil. And I'm giving the floor to the Bulgarian participants. A friend of mine and colleague of mine, Associate Professor Todor Hristov.
Thank you so much. Dear friends, progress is not just a concept, it's a regime of representation, which in principle, Galeria Progressiva can still be discerned beneath the superficial innovations in any museum of history. So, let me sum up its main differential features. First, it organizes a collection of objects into a series which represent an origin and a future, a qualitatively different future, a better tomorrow. Secondly, the origin and the future are held together by a gaze, the gaze of the public, which time is the present, the now, but the present is articulated as a threshold between the origin and the better tomorrow. And third, the regime of representation in Galeria Progressiva involves a peculiar reflexivity. It invites the public to recognize in the exhibits its own past and its own future. But in that sense it functions like a mirror, but this is a biopolitical mirror because it reflects back an image of a species, the humanity, instead of individual images. And fourth, Galeria Progressiva involves a peculiar pedagogy which can be boiled down to this, to a lesson like this. Look, this is the past of the humanity. And this is the model, the threshold for better tomorrow. And if you fail to recognize yourself in the modern, then you are probably backward and you'll soon become a past. Now, the Great Regression seems to me a portfolio of theories rather than a single theory or a debate. A good example of what contemporary financial markets call securitization. An artful collection of different projects which diversifies and balances off their risks, opens up a space for choice and guarantees the success no matter how the events turn out. And still, what I'm going to say now is more relevant to the portfolio of theories rather than to a single contribution. In fact, I find many of the contributions inspiring or intriguing. And I definitely keep in mind that many of the contributors are coming from the left, but still, I'd like to make two claims. The first one, that the Great Regression proposes an inverted version of the representational regime of progress. An inverted version of Galeria Progressiva, probably Galeria Regressiva. To begin with, the Great Regression organizes a collection of events so as to make them represent an origin and the future. And the origin and the future are held together by a gaze, which time, the present, is articulated as a cleavage between the interrupted origin and the looming future. But nevertheless, this Galeria Regressiva manages to retain the particular form of reflection of Galeria Progressiva. It invites us to recognize ourselves in a virtual population, in the cosmopolitan we, which, according to the introduction, we have never been able to say. But this we, defined by its inability to say we, isn't meaningless. It takes its meaning from acts of saying us as opposed to them. In fact, I think that any attempt to enunciate a global we ends up in saying us against them, and an excellent example of this is the brilliant contribution by Donatella Della Porta. She claims that the progressive movements like Occupy managed to articulate a global we, but then this global we again takes its meaning from the opposition between regressive and progressive social movements. However, if the cosmopolitan we takes its meaning from oppositions between us and them, who are they? Hic sunt leones, if I may borrow this phrase from the essay by Zygmunt Bauman. They are terrorists, failed states, populists, fascists, the climate, neoliberalism, capitalism, the irrational masses driven by anger, resentment, despair. They, to put it simply, they are just inhuman. And if the global we takes its meaning from its opposition to them, the inhumans, then this is what's left of humanity. Once Michel Foucault hypothesized that the discursive figure of man could disappear But now the project Great Regression tries to save it by shrinking it to a virtual population besieged by inhumans. It tries to save humanity as endangered species. The second claim I'd like to make, again keeping in mind that many of the contributors come from the left, that the project of Great Regression teaches us a lesson in security. Of course, not the security in the sense of fighting dangers like the police or hopefully the secret services. It instructs us in a concept of security shaped by contemporary neoliberalism. Because neoliberalism is not evil, it's not the enemy. From a governmental perspective, it's just an apparatus of security, based on three principles. The first one can be traced back to classical liberalism, and it claims that we can manage risks more successfully if, instead of trying to stop things from happening, we let them happen. For example, instead of trying to prevent shortages, we should let them happen, because soon they'll trigger the mechanisms of supply and demand, which will regulate the market and restore its equilibrium. But the mechanisms of self-regulation are often blocked or distorted by inadequate governmental regulations. So the best approach to risk management actually is to criticize the inadequate or ineffective acts of power. And the excessive acts of power can be identified by means of two sides of valediction, or to put it differently, by means of two tests, the market and the civil society. Now the second principle, which is specifically neoliberal, holds that market and civil society are not naturally free. Their mechanisms can easily turn out to be self-destructive. And because of that, the markets and the civil society should be a target of relentless governmental intervention. Intervention intended to maintain their freedom. Regulation which aims through deregulation to enable them to self-regulate themselves. And the third principle holds that that the concept of capital can be extended to any social interaction that can be represented as a competition for scarce resources or investment of labor, time, or assets, and therefore capitalism can be extended to any social interaction, and then the risks of any social interaction can be made much more manageable, much more effectively manageable, if it's articulated as a market enterprise. Now, I think that the Great Regression teaches us precisely this concept of security, because it interpolates us as species exposed to risks that can be contained only through a critique of excessive acts of power in favor of global mechanisms of self-regulation. And I think that such a critique justifies the intervention of much more powerful apparatuses than the faltering institutions of representative democracy, and it will actually contribute to the development described by Arjuna Paduraya as emancipation of capitalism from democracy, or by Bruno Latour as the flight of capitalists from the earth. And if this doesn't seem much of progress to you, then my final point, from a regional perspective, progress always seemed somehow inverted. Ever since the height of modernity, representations of progress brought to regional level asked us to identify with a gaze split between the interrupted origin and a better tomorrow which is always not yet, and to recognize ourselves in a fragile we, unable to say we, besieged, if not by inhumans, then by abnormals, for example, by the incorrigible crowd. Of course, this is not a great regression. This is a petty, parochial, regional regression. But still, one of the important questions of the debate so far, at least from my point of view, was how can we regress if we haven't progressed yet? I am afraid, my friends, that this is quite possible. After all, regression and progression are not just state of affairs, not even troubling states of affairs like the declining population or the rising inequality, which we should really think too. But still, progression and regression are effects of a representation apparatus. And progress always seemed like regression in the eyes of the marginalized. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Todor, and thank you to all contributors. Do we have connection with Ivan Krastev?
Yes, I'm here.
Yeah, Ivan. So let me summarize the discussion for you in order to make it easier to comment and to express your opinion of one of the authors of this book and the author of the book After Europe, which was so debatable and so interesting and so provocative. So I'll make my summing up and I take the responsibility for that. First, the local perspective produced certain paradoxes, and I'll list them as follows, following also the list of the speakers. The first one was a temporal paradox. How is it possible to live in a catching up situation, to progress in a project which is already in decline? Is the project still valuable enough to be followed up and catch up? And is this alternative for going back to a strong, and is the only alternative, the going back to a strong national state, is this a really valuable alternative? And this paradox was even sharpened by the statement of Todor Hristov, who said that at the margins, progress produced always marginal abnormal creatures which were in the feeling of regress. So, the second paradox is the institutional paradox, that certain people, social groups in the margins, in the periphery, are living with political bodies and institutions which are not really democratic, even not really neoliberal and rational. They are strange hybrids and imitations. And our Romanian colleague gave very interesting examples with the so-called social democratic parties in the southeastern Europe. But we can prolong this list. We can say that all the institutions are problematic and unstable, the rule of law is unstable itself, and there are low standards of public debate, corruption, and the economy is not rational but irrational and shallow. Third, what is the reason for this unsatisfying situation in the southeastern Europe and Eastern Europe in general? Is it the global condition, that means the advancement of deregulated corporative neoliberal capital, or the real reason are the destructive legacies of state socialism? Fourth, the West, and this was the statement of our Turkish colleague, the West didn't come to terms with what the end of Cold War meant. It never grasped its full social meaning. Is that true? And is that true for the countries in Southeastern Europe and in Eastern Europe in general? Do we grasp the meaning of the Cold War really? And what does it mean to live in such condition without grasping the meaning of the constitutive events of our history? Fourth, it was also mentioned by our Turkish colleague, and I do believe that at this point he tried to discuss a topic which is very dear to your heart, Ivan. This is a topic about the meritocratic cosmopolitan elites and their loss of confidence. Nobody believes them in our countries already, and we are a laboratory for that, for this disbelief, this distrust. because of their ruthlessness, because of their irresponsibility and lack of solidarity with the masses, because of their arrogance, meritocratic arrogance. Against these cosmopolitan meritocratic elites, there is a rise of populist and nationalist rich middle-class elites, which confronted the global, let's say, rival, and they used all possible facilitators for networking, including religion. What to do with this conflict between cosmopolitan meritocratic elites and the populist leaders? Is there any possible rhetoric capable to addressing the problem, or as Vassil Vidinsky said, maybe other measures should be taken, not just rhetorics?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Two more points, and I'm finishing. So, what did we at 1989? Did we restore certain democratic values, or did we celebrate certain democratic values? And I believe it was not a restoration, it was a kind of celebration. A great difference, I believe. And the last point is mine. I do believe that our region is a laboratory of the crisis, not of one utopia, but of three utopias simultaneously. First, for the time being, we are in the midst of the crisis of liberal universalism, its rights and freedoms. Second, in our close past, we experienced the crisis of communist utopia about a classless perfect society. And now we are going to experience once again the crisis and the fall of nationalist utopia about the equal society of natural sisters and brothers. So I believe that this region is a kind of laboratory for the crisis of utopias. And this is something very, very important, because that believes that we are not only an effect of the globalization, we can contribute to the critique of globalization, and we can say something about the crisis of utopias, and we can demonstrate that the utopias have certain costs, and sometimes it's a very bloody cost. I'm put an end here and to give you the floor to command the whole discussion.
Thank you very much. It's very difficult, to be honest, to follow from Skype because there was many interesting things being said. So I'm going really to try to confine myself
a little bit closer to the microphone to hear you.
Yeah. To several. Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Yeah. To several very simple points. First is, strangely enough, I do believe that the book provoked a lot of debate, but it is much more collection of intuition than something modern. It's not a common platform. But if there is something which I do believe is common, nevertheless, that people are framing the problems differently, is that what has dramatically changed is our relations to the future. You can go through this through basically criticizing markets. You can go through this basically trying to see a different relations between globalization and democracy and so on. But I do believe that in a certain way, what we don't see anymore, and probably this is regression, you have a society which is not regulated anymore by certain visions of future. And from this point of view, it's interesting because one of the interesting story about populists is it's a nostalgic parties. You can like or dislike them, they can empower certain groups in society, but they do not have a relation to the future. From this point of view, the demographic anxiety that was very much also touched here, it might has to do something with this. In a society with a declining population, and this is very much true for Western Europe, not only for countries like Bulgaria, this is very much there. In a certain way, you start to fear the future. You can fear migrants, you can fear robots, you can decide what you fear, you can fear everything. The second thing which, Sasha, you have been touching on the problem of the meritocratic elites, I do believe also we see a very interesting and important crisis of education and the way the education is related to society. According to the last opinion polls that I saw, only 30% of the voters of the Republican Party in the United States believe that American universities contribute for the good of society. So strangely enough, you have the two major institutions that have been responsible for kind of a universalist view of the world. The church, particularly in the case of Europe, it was the Catholic Church and the university, and both of them are in crisis. And here is the paradox which I found very central. The globalization, the fact that we are living in a much more connected common world, led to the crisis of any universalist ideologies. So it's not by accident, for example, the countries which were famous for being very religious in a certain way, should be very devoted to certain type of universal teachings, like Poland, did not react to certain type of crisis like the migration in the way basically you expect them to do. And I do believe it has something to do with the fact, and this is what I see, the paradox of globalization, which was very well spelled by somebody like Danny Rodrik, who claimed in a globalized world you cannot have three things at the same time: sovereignty, democracy, and economic integration. I mean, in the global economy. You can always take two of them and never the third in a package. So as a result of it, I do believe that Central and Eastern Europe, everybody was trying to explain what is happening in our country simply as a legacy problem. But there is a lot of things to do. I don't believe that the legacy explanation does not work. But I do believe that, and here I'm going very much to agree with you, to a certain extent, till yesterday, Eastern Europe was perceived as a kind of somebody coming from the past, and everything that we have been seeing was explained as on the base of this past, on the base of what we don't have, and so on and so on. I do believe that many problems that we have are very much coming from the future. And we're going to see a major transformation of society. We can call it great regression or not, but I do believe it's not simply a certain type of political regimes or ideas, but a certain type of society does not work anymore. And this is not by accident that nobody in the book basically is pushing for any type of solutions. But this is also not very new. I have been recently rereading something that Herzen said, and he said the following in his book, in his memoirs. He said, do not look for solution in this book. The modern man does not have a solution. But the modern man probably did not have a solution, but at least he had the utopians. And now you have this type of a post-utopian, not anti-utopian. From this point of view, it's different than previous periods. But you have a post-utopian society that should live only with the present, and time has been very much, thinking in terms of time, has been very much replaced by geographical comparisons. Is it the same everywhere? I don't know. One of the interesting for me moments was when, in one of his earlier books, Pankray Mishra was claiming that the most important European war, from the point of view of the developing world, was the Russian-Japanese War of 1905. The war that basically does not exist in our political imagination. Because for them, for the first time, a white empire was basically defeated by non-white people. So, strangely enough, I don't believe also that Cold War is going to be the major reference in the coming 2 or 3 decades. Strangely enough, decolonization comes as a bigger narrative through which people basically start to relate, and not surprisingly, many of us start to face political problems that some of the post-colonial society has been facing in the 60s and 70s. Relations to the majority, relations to political identities, and all this. Hello? Hello?
Yeah, hello. We are here. Do you hear us? Professor Parvu, do we have connection?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah. So waiting for Ivan for his last words. The connection has been broken. I will give for very short statements the floor to the speakers and then to the general public. Professor Parvu, it's your turn first.
Thank you. Yeah, this was an extremely rich set of exchanges, and I think a lot of very good points have been raised. I'm not sure how to systematize or how to come back to any of these in specific, because it's a really good kind of discussion. Which brings me, for instance, to this, a lot of discussions that I followed were trying to go away from this classical explanation whenever we discuss about Central and Eastern Europe, that it's somehow catching up with the kind of explanatory aims concerning modernization and democratization that it's about catching up with. And only recently we realized that in fact this region was more or less a laboratory for many other kind of evolutions that were actually more not advanced in a sort of normative sense, but yeah, which actually become, as you and Ivan Krastev was mentioning just now. So this is for us an opportunity to really think about our own experiences and about the meanings of the political phenomena and the political vocabularies that we have been using here concerning our region to try to make it, in a sense, yeah, to make it open and a sort of a reflection, but also an explanation of those phenomena that are described in the book. I also wanted to go back to the issue of what you call institutional paradox, because I think it's one of the crucial aspects to understand our predicament today. The fact that it's not simply the elites who have lost their credentials, let's say, with a larger public, but it's the institutions themselves. We have a huge phenomenon regarding the lack of not lack of credibility or lack of trust in institutions, but lack of capacity of these institutions to actually fulfill the promises and the meaning for which many of them were set up. And it was brought in this discussion several times. It was brought the notion of meritocracy. Of course, this is a really crucial debate right now, and I think institutions, bureaucratic institutions, independent regulatory institutions, classical institutions of the rule of law, they were all based on the notion that they are able to deliver a sense of competence, expertise, and public spiritedness. And we have to inquire much more in the reasons for which these institutions are actually not, why these institutions are now traversing such a tremendous crisis. It's I think, not only, again, a sort of revolt against elites, but also something which connects to the reason that the institutions actually now are also undergoing a massive crisis.
Do you have something more to say?
Sorry?
Do you have something more to say, or will that be the end of your statement?
This is the end.
Okay, thank you very much. So if any of the other speakers is willing to say something more, to take part in the discussion, please, now is the moment.
I would like to add just two more things. First, I'm not sure that I do agree with Ivan Krastev that nobody in this book, The Great Regression, didn't offer solutions. Actually, from the 15 articles, only 3 people didn't offer solutions. There are many solutions at the end of each of the articles, and I'm afraid that none of them work. That's why I just stress that.
That's contradictory.
Exactly. So that's why I try to stress on the idea of the contradiction. Then, when you have contradictions, the solution is not actually the solution. And the second thing, which I just forgot to tell you, that of course there is a decline of the population in Europe. But what is really specific for Bulgaria, and it's just staggering the speed of this decline, is that basically in 2008, from 220 states in all the world, Bulgaria is on the 10th place for declining population. 8 years afterwards, it's on the 6th, and this year it's on the 3rd, which is really amazing, like such a steep decline. I think if we have this local perspective, I think it's important because it's out of this economical paradigm, but I think it's quite typical for the feeling I think we have of our society now. And on this point of view, the regression is not only about values, it's not only about economic itself, it's about how the society itself deals with the contradictions?
Maybe I can add something about the same, let's say, going beyond the economic paradigm, which has been addressed by Vassil Vidinsky. I would like to add that the index of happiness, the so-called index of happiness, is really also very symptomatic for Bulgaria. In 2015, Bulgaria was on the 134th place concerning happiness. On 2016, it was on the 129th place, and this year it was in 150th place. But this situation with the happiness is incompatible with the economic growth of the Bulgarian economy, which is much quicker and more rapid than the index of happiness. Although we are a little bit better than before, nevertheless we are in a catastrophic, unsatisfied situation. Who else?
I'd like to disagree that our societies have lost their connection to the future. The relationship to the future is now simply articulated as risk. We may not live in utopian societies now, but we still live in a risk society, or probably a risk control society. This is my intervention.
We live in dystopian society.
No, not exactly. Dystopia is still closely related to utopia. But we calculate risks even while we eat. We consume risks every day. And this is the future. Thank you.
Okay, I do believe that this is the end of the contributions of the contributors. So is the turn of the general public. Please, everybody is invited to take part in the discussion, but speak on the microphone in English. In a risk society, nobody is eager to take the risk. So, you see, once again, last invitation for voluntary speakers. Then this will be the end of this interesting roundtable. Thank you very much. Thank you, Antoinette. Thank you, Professor Parvu. Thank you, Stilyan Yotov, Vassil Vidinsky. Thank you, Todor, Hristov. Thank you, Soli, Ozel, and Ivan Krastev. I hope he hears us. Sorry. And I would like to remind everybody that we are going to make a volume on that local contributions to the Great Regress issue. So be ready to propose something, and speakers will develop their statements. Thank you very much.